In about 10 seconds here.
Countdown from
Go ahead.
Well, I'm glad you can make it this morning as we talk about Ireland and the power of stories. A little brief insight into some of what I learned, discovered, heard on my sabbatical, and hopefully kind of a look forward to some of the things we'll be doing here at Derry over the next year. So in Northern Ireland, which is really kind of a contested borderland between Britain and Ireland, and now really between a diminished UK and a diminished Europe, folks at the Corrymeela Community and other reconcilers understand stories as the space where we can speak our questions, express our uncertainty and brokenness, the hurt done to others by us, and the hurt done to us by others. So in this ethnic frontier borderland shaped by the ebb and the flow of mutual fears and antagonisms, stories can be uncomfortable and discomforting. They can also be restorative and transformative, surprises that open us up life to us and others we live in the midst of. So often stories can we hear somebody's story and it can kind of hurt. Sometimes if we are the ones that maybe did the hurting to them. But other times stories give us brand new insight into people's lives, adventures, and so much more. So as I studied in Ireland and heard stories of pain, of violence and oppressive history, or hope, or friendship, I found so many similarities between there and here. We also need a space for stories, because a space for stories becomes a space of engagement. And engagement and experience precedes understanding. And that's something we often don't have a lot of for each other. We don't understand our neighbors, the differences, why people think and act the way they do. We tell stories about them, but we don't always listen to them to understand. So I want to share just a few things I've learned about stories, and there's a bunch, but I can only pick like 4 because I only have like 45 minutes. So I have to do this other church service thing. But one thing, stories sometimes give us bridges to freedom. So there's a guy named Winfried Makler. He was a friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and both were members of the Confessing Church, opposed to Hitler. So the Confessing Church was kind of against the German Christian church that kind of said, hey, let's go all in on nationalism and Nazism. We can kind of wrap the flag of around the cross and present it as one. And the Confessing Church was like, well, let's take a pause on that for a second. And they wrote what eventually became the Barmen Declaration that's in our Book of Confessions. So Bonhoeffer was killed by a Nazi executioner in April 1945. But as a student, this guy named Derek Wilson, a former leader of the Corrymeela Community and someone I spent some time with in Ireland, he met Makler for a morning in Berlin many years ago and heard his story. For him to stand opposed to Hitler was a very isolated existence. Coming from a very nationalist family as he did meant that he had to really go out on a limb and be kind of estranged from his family to say, whoa, wait a minute here, this doesn't jive with who Jesus is and who the church is supposed to be. He argued then that to be a human being is to live together with different others with grace and humility. This is often not easy, but is something to work for and remain clear about. So he really went out on a limb. As I mentioned on Tuesday, the former pastor at Derry Presbyterian Church said, even the turtle to move forward has to stick out its neck. Makler stuck out his neck, risking estrangement for his family, arrest by the Nazis, to kind of stay true to the church and to try to reach out across differences. So Makler knew deeply about the power of an open and inclusive community encountering narrow, excluding, nationalistic, populist cultures. After the war, Winfried worked with the ecumenically minded Christian community he was a part of, and the remnants of the Jewish community there in Germany, and the growing Muslim community in Berlin to build new forms of community, of these interreligious people working together, understanding each other, trying to work for peace and understanding. He died at the age of 93. Another guy is Ray Davey. He was the founder of the Corrymeela Community of reconciliation in Northern Ireland. Ray was a prisoner of war for 3 years, ending in Dresden when it was carpet bombed. Throughout his POW experience, he came to the view that while food was essential to live, hope and some wider sense of communal belonging was essential to survive and for mental well-being. As a survivor, then he dedicated himself to building experiences of open community in Ireland and beyond. In the 1950s, he established the German Northern Irish Students Exchange programs involving homestays in both countries, something really totally out of the box in terms of building peace between countries previously at war. We see a lot of similar things happening now. Ray was really one of the first to start something like that. And in 1965, he established a reconciliation community, the Corrymeela Community, centered on a 10-acre site bought for €9,000 right by Ballycastle on the Antrim coast in Northern Ireland. And Derek had worked with him there. So Corrymeela is a place for practical programs of reconciling work, bringing children, young people, and adults of diverse backgrounds to meet together and work practically to establish and sustain programs that promote a more open, diverse, and shared society. 51 years on, it is a space owned by a community of Catholic and Protestant together in Northern Ireland, one of the few places where Catholics and Protestants share ownership. It's a shared space open to all in the midst of this borderland where so many community spaces are still owned by either one tradition or the other. Ray also died in his 90s. So apparently if you do good reconciling work, you get to live into your 90s. Causation and correlation. Stories can also challenge narrow views of neighbors. So I've had the privilege over the course of my life to be in a relationship with people who led very different lives from me for a variety of reasons. And each time I've heard their stories, I've had to expand my view and understanding of them and others. This has happened as I've learned the stories of LGBTQ friends, of Jewish rabbis, of Muslim imams, of black church leaders, of immigrants, of refugees. Each time my worldview is forced to expand as I hear these people's stories. I may have had judgments about them based on what others said or what I assumed by living in my waspy world, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, pretty privileged world. I was often also judgmental rather than curious. I heard stories about others told by people like me instead of finding folks of difference and asking curious questions about them. There's this great show called Ted Lasso. It's going to enter its third and maybe final season pretty soon, in the fall maybe, it's sad. So I want to show a little clip of Ted Lasso here. So in this kind of rich owner of this soccer club kind of looks down on this kind of folksy American football coach who's now coaching a soccer team and challenges him to a game of darts. And he's like, oh, okay, I guess I can play darts. And the owner kind of pulls out his fancy, I happen to have these professional darts here with me. So they start a game and have this wager that has ramifications for the show. But we will show, close that. I said close that. Why won't you close? Be scared. There we go. Showing the right thing there. Thanks. All right. No, there's no sound. We did not check the sound first. Let's see if we can get this first. Doesn't really work. Okay, we just won't show. Sad. Try to check this out. I know. So basically what Ted Lasso says is, so I've never seen this quote from Walt Whitman on a billboard when he was younger, and it said, be curious, not judgmental. And it always stuck with me. And it kind of makes the point to the other guy, if you had been curious, you might have asked me, Ted, have you played a lot of darts? And I'd have said, yep. Since I was a boy, my dad took me to this bar and he would talk and I would just shoot darts on hours on end with them. Well, Ted was a pretty good dart player, but no one took the time to ask. Often we make judgments about people without asking questions of them. We make judgments about this group, that group, instead of being curious to say, well, tell me why you do this. Tell me more about this. You know, it's interesting, the refugee family that has moved into the Love Inc. house that our church is helped supporting. They're from Syria, and as we learn more about them, we learn, they have advanced degrees from top universities, have all these computer knowledge and things, and sometimes what I think the judgment about some of these refugees is, oh, they don't have a lot of skills, they're just going to have to work in a warehouse, when they were top professionals often, who were forced to flee their house, flee their home, and start over. But we often don't ask about their experience. What did you do before this? Your education, your experiences. Sometimes they're amazing people with so much stories to share, so many resources and wisdom that they can share with the world, but they often aren't asked. Be curious, not judgmental. So Derek Wilson, this Corrymeela former leader, had the privilege of meeting and working with women and men associated with the adult education of the European lay academies in Holland and Germany, especially where storytelling was a major educational approach post-World War II. A common thread was that for many of their families had given sanctuary to members of the Jewish community, hiding them or assisting them to flee during World War II. And for all the people I've mentioned, Derek talks about, principles and values were central to their lives. Different others had to be embraced if they were to build a more open and welcoming culture. Their sense of neighborliness went far beyond those who lived beside them or those who were like them. In other words, each believed and practiced the power of meeting with the different other, even those they were brought up to see as the enemy. And at different times, different cultures maybe were the enemy in your lives. You know, during the 60s it was the Russians. Now it's the Russians. You know, you look at movies and who the bad guys are, right? That gives a hint of who we're taught to see as enemies. And over the course of my life, the main villains have either been Russians or Middle Eastern people or sometimes Far East people. Those are the ones we're seeing are these are the bad ones. And you're kind of taught that. And it's in the wider culture. Can we reach out to those that we're taught these are the enemy? Sometimes we're taught the other political party's the enemy. Don't talk to those folks. Sometimes you may have been raised with this race or this religion, whether it's Mormonism or whether it's Judaism or Islam. When I was in Peoria, there was a lot of Islamophobia and hate for Islam around 2016. And it was getting kind of rampant and a problem. My friend, the mom, Camille Mufti, his wife was just berated and verbally assaulted when she went to grocery stores. And so we had to do something about that and create a place where people could come in and learn about Islam. So we opened up the mosque to the whole community, had community leaders come and share their experiences, had the mosque share more about their religion. So we had about 700 people come into this mosque. We shared a meal together to create a space where people could actually go and engage with the other. Sometimes that's necessary. Because education, learning about each other, the actual systems of religious beliefs or political beliefs or their culture or their country, it's emancipatory and freeing. It's about gaining a voice, about critically reflecting on the reasons we did and do things, and the new choices we make to live in more open manners that nurture democracy and good life together. So, hearing all of these stories of folks I've talked with of different religions, different races, different cultures, those stories are now a part of my experience, a part of my wisdom. And in a countercultural way, these stories that maybe you've heard throughout your life, reaching out to difference, point us to create a world where our well-being and common security will emerge from us protecting and affirming our diverse differences, not in protecting our so-called singular identities. Which so often happens, we want to protect what our way of life of thinking is to the exclusion and sometimes disillusion of other groups. And then they have to then circle their wagons and protect themselves. And what we have is clashes of civilizations, of religions, of ideologies. Stories and being curious can help us see that need to affirm diverse differences and create that better world where we can be together in difference. So stories can also create private spaces to meet the other, sometimes breaking the taboos of not being together. So the nature of politics in the contested society of Northern Ireland is that people often exercise their power in favor of their own side. Does that sound familiar? That's how we often do. If you're in power, you help your side and sometimes purposely hurt the other side. Sides and identities dominated, they trumped equal citizenship in Ireland. Before the emergence of the civil rights campaign in the 1960s, the Irish one, not ours, but there are certainly some similarities, public housing was allocated by locally elected councils, which then mirrored the often sharp and distrustful opposed political viewpoints. Housing allocations were one dominant site where political power in favor of your own was exercised. So whoever had the political power, the Protestants, got all the best stuff, relegated the Catholics or the Irish nationalists to ghettos, basically. So in the late 1990s, Derek Wilson, who I mentioned, was sitting together with a group of counselors from all these political parties. And at this time, some did still not want to even be seen meeting with the others, because they might be seen as a traitor and be attacked themselves. It was so bad, like some people I talked to would go into their own churches and they would get booed and hissed because they were known to be working with a Catholic on a police force or trying to bring people together. People were attacked for trying to bring peace because there was that much animosity. So he says, we were in an open circle reflecting together when one local counselor suddenly spoke up and said, I want to say something to you all. 30 plus years ago, I voted along party lines and kept a Catholic family out of a house they should have been allocated. Being here together with you all, I regret that action. I wish I had the courage of my own convictions then and not followed the party line. People follow the party line a lot, and when they don't, they often get ousted by whatever party it is. Religious, political, social. Everybody has to do it this way, protect our own. And when someone has the courage to say, well, maybe this isn't the best, they're attacked. We've seen that, haven't we? Now, in itself, at the time, this was a remarkable thing for a counselor to say even 30 years on, risking the ire from his own tradition and party. I said in a sermon right before I left for Ireland that the imperative is to be in deep relationship with people who represent the thing you consider to be the opposite of your point of view. And that is costly. It's painful. It might cause you to be called a traitor by some of your own. And you will find yourself in all kinds of unexpected circumstances where you find empathy and sympathy for people coming from different points of view than you, and that will cause tension. Derek said, spoken out of the blue, without conditions, without pressure, this was a surprise break in a decade-old silence and traditional way of thinking and acting. No one said these things. Everyone in the room then knew that for this moment, they were in a new shared space, and no one knew where to look or what to say. There was a deep silence. They knew a deep cultural taboo had been broken. You don't go against party lines, you don't admit to wrong. And they were now together in uncharted territory. What do we do next? This man had told a story that acknowledged how destructive many of the old ways were. He offered a gift of regret and a space for deeper engagement between them all. Now, if they chose to enter that space together, sometimes you're presented with an opportunity. Somebody opens up something new, a shared story. We can either go into that together, engage with it, or be like, this is awkward, I don't want to have to risk this, and we disengage. After a moment, a counselor from a diametrically opposed party spoke, and he said, "Hearing you, I'm moved to speak too. We are all getting on in the years, and I too have many regrets. I regret that before entering politics, I took part in acts of violence. There was no loss of life, but there was pain and hurt, for which I am now very sorry." The members of this group had moved into a new space of their own making, a space of surprises where they all learned something new and where they all moved forward for a moment on a shared journey together. Now, such experiences and stories might only be small shafts of light piercing a dark landscape, soon to be snuffed out, or they were and are stories of contrast that give new possibilities if people exercise new choices. The old ways might still dissolve their power, but there are still real stories and real spaces to which people gained a new voice, at least for a moment. Spaces where, through an expression of a regret, taking a risk, they wished to break free of those old cultural ways that at the time may have made more cultural common sense, but now needed to be overturned. I think most of us can look back at our lives and kind of think of old cultural ways that this is the way you talk about things, this is the way you do things, this is who you spend time with, this is who you don't spend time with, this is what you talk about, this is what you never talk about. We have those rules in our lives, and sometimes they need to be overturned because they don't fit anymore. But to do so can be scary. Not everyone's going to go along at the same pace you might be wanting to go along. And that can be hard. Some of you were alive during school immigration and things like that. Maybe you lived in the South, it was even a bigger deal. And maybe you risked being seen having lunch with a black colleague, and maybe some of your other colleagues were like, "Nope, can't do that." I remember the powerful moment in the classic TV show Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Classic show where for the first time he put his feet in a kiddie pool with an actor who played a black police officer, and that was a big deal. And people got really mad about that. People like to get mad about things on TV. I don't know if you know that, but they do. People like to get mad about a lot of things. But he, for a moment, was sharing this space, traversing this cultural taboo that you don't do that. And people got angry at Mr. Rogers. But he was like, "He's my neighbor. This is how you treat a neighbor." But he was breaking some of these old cultural taboos. Sometimes one of the first, and it takes courage to be that first person. I wonder if this church can have courage to be that first person, to break some of these cultural taboos that are old, or even some new ones that are being formed now, that 30 years from now we'll look back and say, why did we do that? Why did we make up these rules? So the storytelling space that they had in this moment, these different counselors, allowed people to hear a previously forbidden story, taking a risk that opened each other up to each other in an unexpected manner. The storytelling space that allowed people to exercise a new choice, to enter into new relationships with one another, and create embryonic new structures, new ways of being together that previously weren't thought to even be possible. Now, politics in Ireland didn't suddenly change from then on. Oh, they had this meeting and they shared some regret. Now everything is hunky-dory in the political landscape. People are now working for the common good instead of their own good. That did not happen. But for a moment, these people changed the ways they and we were together. We can do that too. So Derek is not claiming that single events change all. Having a space of storytelling when people of diversity come and we share past faults and we learn about each other, it's not going to change everything. But he does claim that without such single storytelling events, no new patterns will be established. Ways that will eventually lead us into new development spaces and structures together. It's kind of like, an animal going through the woods. The first time it cuts through a path to the stream. Doesn't make a new trail that everybody follows, but maybe somebody else will follow. He'll go again and again, that same path. You keep having that same storytelling path, and eventually a trail is worn where other animals will begin to follow. It doesn't happen overnight. But if we can create a space for stories of difference, eventually a path can be worn where other people just naturally follow. That's how change is made. So, such experiences of these storytelling environments model the new shared political and civic structures together that can be imaginable. And I think that's what we need in this country, not between loyalists and Irish Republicans, but between Democrats and Republicans, between different religions, different even ways of understanding one religion, and all these other divides we find ourselves in. It seems like we segment ourselves in so many different ways. We label ourselves, and we often don't like people outside our label. We eye them with suspicion. Another thing I learned is being listened to can be a form of justice. Now, I've said a lot, you may have heard before, but I said that listening is so close to loving that we can hardly tell the difference. To be heard, to be loved is to be heard. Sometimes all you need is just somebody to listen. They don't have to fix it. And I've had to learn that over my time as a pastor. I'm a fixer. I want to immediately fix everything. I want to jump in, solve the problem. And I've had to learn sometimes I can't solve the problem. I have a sermon coming up about that, but I think it's not until next October of 2023. But be ready. Put it on the calendar. I think it's there. I forget all these different stories, but I've had to learn that sometimes you can't just fix it. Actually, I think there's one about that coming up in a couple of weeks. Like, I want to fix it, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just to sit and listen and allow someone to share their story. So at Corrymeela, there have often been pretty politically sensitive meetings. They had spaces where they had to secretly bring all these leaders together so no one knew they were meeting together. Especially in the midst of conflict between people from opposed political traditions, people with paramilitary history, civil servants, and sometimes ministers associated with the British and Irish government. And I mean like political ministers, not church ministers. They have different words over there. So over some years, there have been several remarkable weekends. One when Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald, who became the Irish Prime Minister, stayed in listening mode for a whole weekend with people who were very opposed to his views and prepared to act violently in the wider community, listening but not always agreeing, honoring their experience and concerns. They revised later that had it not been for that respectful listening, there would have been considerable violence some weeks later. This was listening as a form of justice. I've said it so many times, listening is so close to loving, we can hardly tell the difference. To be heard is to be loved and honored and respected. So, one of the things I want to work on here at Dairy is helping this place become a space for stories, where we can engage with each other, hear each other's stories, start wearing that path through the woods that eventually others can follow. So one thing I want to try, if you're amenable to it, is starting this thing called Engaged Stories. You know, we have engaged worship sometimes on Saturday night with Billy Joel music or Elton John or the Beatles. I want to do engaged stories. We have a space to engage each other's stories, to just be able to listen to someone else's story. So here's how it might work, and we'll probably tinker with it as we go. But right now we meet down in room 7. And it won't be live streamed or anything, because we want people to be able to feel they can tell their stories in a safe space, not have it broadcast out to the world, right? Have room 7, kind of set it up in a more kind of cozy, comfy feel. We're going to do some renovations to room 7 here coming up too, to make it look less church basement-y, more welcoming and more. Be on the lookout for that too, that's happening. Be done there and have 5 to 7 people be willing to share a personal story. Not someone else's story, but their own personal story for no more than 10 minutes. They have to practice and rehearse. They have to keep their story under 10 minutes. So, and hold them to that. And each time we'll have a central theme around which these stories will kind of revolve. And so they'll tell their story for about 10 minutes. and then we're going to open up a space for curious and brave questions. Because I think we have lost the art of asking good questions, because we often ask self-serving questions. We ask a question that sets us up to make a response. Or we ask gotcha questions. Or the thing I hate most, have you ever gone to like a panel discussion and someone gets up to ask a question and they don't actually ask the question, they just want to share their point of view. And then it's like, at the end, they ask, well, what's your question? And they basically end up saying, what do you think about all I just said? That's not a curious question. That's you trying to share your story. There's a time for that. But we've lost the art of just asking curious questions to learn more about each other. You hear a story and you ask a question, help me understand. Could you tell me more about? Dig deeper. We often so quickly want to turn it back to ourselves. We become a very kind of me-focused society. And here's someone else's story, like, ooh, that reminds me of my story. I want to share it now. And let's sit with this story and ask about it. What can we learn from this person who just offered this gift of a very personal story? What wisdom is there in it for us? Where might I find how their story could intersect with my story? Can we learn to listen, not to respond, not to change somebody else, but listen with the expectation of receiving a gift and insight and wisdom? So I want to start it just with church members we know and hear some of their stories, because we honestly don't know that much about each other. And if you look around this room now, can you share a good 10 minutes about each person in this room, about their life? No. Some might not even be able to do 1 minute. I'm always so fascinated when I get to go and just sit with people and learn things. And I learn things all the time. I'm sad at funerals, but I often find funerals just so interesting, because I learned so much about folks I never knew. Because things that happened 30 years ago I never got to see. Just recently, we had a service for Linda Rhodes. And Bill Alexander was sharing, and he shared about something I learned about Bill I'd never heard before. He shared a story where they'd gone to Vietnam with Linda Rhodes. And he shared that how when he was in Vietnam, he had worked to build a bridge over a river there. That was his job on the engineering board. I didn't know he was in Vietnam the first one. I didn't know he was built a bridge over there. I didn't know he was in charge of that bridge building. All things I'm learning. Well, he talked about how Linda kind of made the tour bus driver go and find this bridge. He's like, I get in trouble if I deviate from the course. And Linda was like, you're going to see this bridge. This man gave over a year of his life to build you a bridge. Now go see this bridge. And so they went to see the bridge. You know, they go, and Bill talked about how it was, a lot of ways, it was closure for him to see this bridge. And there was a man from the village who came and was like, why are these white Americans looking at this out-of-the-way bridge? And he was kind of curious. There's the first thing. He was curious. He didn't judge them like, why are they here for our bridge? He was curious. And it turns out he had a picture of the old army crew building that bridge together. And so he invited them into his house, and they saw the picture, and they shared stories. Closure. Curiosity. All this I get from listening to someone else's story, and I want to learn more. I'm constantly learning stories about you. You all have such a wealth of experience, of challenge, of pain, of perseverance, of joy. There's so much we can learn from one another. But how often do we have space just to sit and listen to each other's stories? Because if we're honest, we talk to the same people most Sundays, don't we? We go to the fellowship table, we kind of get with our little group. We sit in our same pews. I'm a creature of habit. I just sit in the same spot in restaurants all the time. We talk with who we're used to talking to. But then our worldviews aren't expanded. So we want to have these events where we just get to hear stories. Where we don't have to engage right away. We just get to sit and listen and receive a gift from somebody else. So the first engaged stories is going to be September 10th. I believe it's at 6 o'clock or 6:30, one of those. in room 7. And we're going to get in the final storytellers, but we have a few. I might start with 5 this first time. George Porter's going to tell a story. We all know George can spin a yarn, so that should be fun and interesting. Natalie Taylor, one of our college students, is going to tell a story. She just went to Poland recently and taught English as a second language to some of the Ukrainian refugees there. I wonder if that's going to be part of her story. Sarah Woodbury is going to tell a story. I have to look back at my list of everybody's going to come this time. Others have said they want to be able to come. And so maybe you have a story you want to tell. This time's theme is called Once in a Lifetime, where you can tell any story about anything that happened that you see once in a lifetime. It can be a once in a lifetime experience, a once in a lifetime relationship, a once in a lifetime trip, anything that was once in a lifetime that you feel in some way changed you, changed your point of view, changed your identity, changed your course in life. Sometimes you have a once in a lifetime moment that changes the trajectory of your life. You say, "Ooh, I thought I wanted to do this in my life, but now this." These are the stories that form our lives, and we can learn from each other. So I want to start with the church, learning about each other more, getting used to hearing each other's stories and asking those questions. Then I like to bring some people in from outside the church to come and share stories. Maybe it's people of other faiths, other cultures, other just upbringings, and hear some of their stories. And help us now really start to engage in difference and say, what can we learn? You know, maybe as this refugee family learns better English and maybe they share their story. And I'm sure it's powerful. And then if that goes well, eventually we take this on the road and go outside the church building to the community and offer to the community, hey, here's a chance to hear and share stories. Something similar was done in Northern Ireland by a guy named Padraig O'Tuma. And I had another video clip that I was going to let y'all watch while I left and got ready for the service. He kind of talks more about some of his stories and the power of stories. And maybe I can finagle this to get it to work. But they started something called a 10x9, where 9 people speak for 10 minutes. And they don't really have questions afterwards, but they had this kind of coffee house motif. And now you have to, it's gotten pretty big, hundreds of people go. You have to apply online to tell the story. But it's become a real storytelling event that's healing for people, that's engaging, that's educational. In the midst of, we often tell stories about other people. You don't often listen to their own stories about us. So last week I talked about Samson and Delilah. One of our members is kind of like, we talk about calls in our lives. I wonder what Delilah's call in her life was, based on this story we heard. And I said, I wonder. This is a story the Israelites tell about Delilah. Have you ever wondered how the Philistines talk about Delilah? I wonder what story Delilah tells about herself. Have you ever thought about that? Sometimes even in Scripture, the Bible tells a story about a group of people or a person that may not be the same story that group tells about themselves. So, in the book of Ruth, I'm going to do a whole series on Ruth in January, February. It's a really interesting book. But Ruth is a Moabite. And there's a whole lot in Scripture about how bad the Moabites are. You do not want to hang out with Moabites. Now the story the Israelites tell about the Moabites is, so after the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing, some of the daughters of Lot basically get them drunk and they have an incestuous relationship with their father. And so Moabites are basically from this incestuous relationship, and that's the beginning of the Moabites. And that's the story the Israelites tell about the origins of Moab. Do you think that's the story the Moabites tell about themselves? Probably not. Think about all the stories you tell about this or that group, because you've heard through the grapevine, or you kind of assume. How often have you let that group tell you their story? This always happens. We create narratives. Each news station creates their narrative about so-and-so group and tells that story. Everybody who only watches that news group begins to think that story is the truth. But they don't tell their story. Or you hear about so-and-so down the road. I remember as kids, there's always like, there's this old person who lives down the street, and they'll beat children or something. I remember the old do you remember Home Alone? Anybody watch Home Alone? The classic movie that makes violence really funny. Later I look back and I really thought that was funny, but these poor criminals are getting badly hurt. But there's a story that the kids tell about the guy who's salting the road. It's like, he murdered somebody, put him in this salt can. They're all scared of this guy because they're telling a story about him. It's not to the end of the movie that Kevin, the guy that's left home alone, ends up kind of sitting with them and learns, he misses his son and his grandchild, and he's lonely. And this is the guy that ends up basically saving Kevin's life. He had believed the story others told about this man. When he finally got to hear it from this man, a friendship was formed. That's the power of stories. Stories can do a whole lot of harm when there are fake stories running around, or only one side of a story. And they can do so much healing when we have a chance to actually hear each other's stories. So I'm hoping with this fall we can kind of dig into engaged stories. I hope you'll come to some of these events and have an opportunity to listen to some of the church members that maybe you've seen in the pews, but maybe you've never actually had a conversation with. Or seen come up and sing a solo on stage, but never heard about their life at all. And then maybe we'll get to learn from folks in the community. You would never have the opportunity to hear or listen to their story from otherwise. Because the hope I have for the church kind of moving forward as we come out of COVID isn't just to go back to normal and say, hey, let's get together and be in fun relationship again. That's not enough. And it's not enough just to do mission work. Lots of places are doing that kind of stuff. Social organizations are doing that. I think what the world needs the church to do is to lead the way, to carve that path through the woods that shows us how we can live better together and with God. Because that's what the churches weren't doing in Iowa. Every person I talked to spoke of that deep regret that the churches were not taking a lead on reconciling all this violence and pain and division. They were actually places that stoked the division and the pain and the violence. And the Gospels are so much about an invitation to live a new and better life together. And throughout the epistles, it talks about how we are given a ministry of reconciliation, not just with God, but with each other. And the churches were silent. They didn't risk anything. They didn't take the lead to help heal their neighborhoods, their cities, their country. We have all kinds of divisions. There's political divisions, there's religious divisions, there's economic divisions, there's sport rivalry division that sometimes get violent. How much is the church doing to heal that? How much is the church doing to help people learn to be better together? To help people forge new relationships, to create that society where we work for the common good of each other, that promotes the diversity and the difference. And that's what the Gospels call us to. And for a large part, most churches throughout history have not dug into that. It's always been these outside groups, people like Ray Davies starting a Corrymeela, people like Winfried Mailer starting a ministry. It always has to be done almost outside and around the church instead of through the church. Does that seem wrong to anybody else? When so much of the Gospels is love God, love neighbor, love your enemy, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, give the cloak off your back, be reconciled. And one of the key passages of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, hey, if you're going to church and you realize someone has something against you, stop. Put your gift down, go and be reconciled, then come back. And that's not just something that you did to somebody else, that you have this primary relationship. Think about, does anyone in the world have something against you? Because of what you've done, what you haven't done, the long-term consequences of how we spend our money, how we vote, how we speak. It can go a long way, and you can realize There's a lot of people in the world who may have something against me and have a legitimate claim. Am I going to ignore it or try to fix it? And some things, it can almost seem too big to be able to handle. I remember when I was in the Doctor of Ministry program on preaching, we had one of the classes was preaching for social transformation. And at that time, there was that factory that fell down in Indonesia that killed all those workers. And one of my friends did a sermon about how he kind of, for the first time, looked at his shirt and realized he had a lot of shirts that were probably made in a factory like that he supported and never really even thought, well, where does this come from? He said, I wanted to start really thinking about where I got my clothes, how it affected people, where I got my food, how it affected people, where I went to fast food, how it affected people. Because sometimes without us even knowing, we can be perpetrating violence on people 8 steps down the way and not realizing it. Because we have the luxury of not having to realize it. So we can ignore it. But should we? Maybe they have something against us, and rightly so. That's what I'm hoping the church can do. Can we be a force, a visionary, a model of what it looks like to live well together? So much of the Gospels is about, so much of the Bible is about life together. The whole covenant is about how to live life better together. The book of Exodus is really kind of a contrast. Here's how the ways of empire in Egypt are to live. Now here's the better way you can live together. So much of the Bible is about good life with God and with each other. And often we focus on life with God and not life together. And I think we've seen sometimes the problems when we don't live well together. We have shootings in schools and riots that cause damage and political violence back and forth. We've seen in other countries that happens here. We can wait till it gets really, really bad and then say, oh, we should probably do something about this. That's what happened in Ireland. Eventually they said, we're going to keep dying unless we find a way to live together. And our kids are going to keep dying unless we find a way to work together, find a way to live together. It got so bad, they had to find a way to peace. I don't know about you, but I don't want it to be like that here. So can we start finding a way to live better together now? And I think one of the best ways to do that is through the power of stories. So we have a couple minutes. Anybody have any questions, comments, snide remarks? No. So in September, first in October, I'm going to be doing a series of sermons on kind of reconciliation, sharing some more of these stories, but what reconciliation means. How do you start the process? It by no means covers everything. It's a big topic. And then in January and February, I'll be talking about Ruth and about borders and belongings and the borders we create for ourselves, culturally, religiously, all these things. And I hope we'll have more of these engaged stories events and other events that really focus on how do we live well together. I think our VBS next year is going to kind of focus on the idea of, the neighborhood. With Mr. Rogers, how we are a good neighbor to each other. I watched Mr. Rogers and Daniel Tiger, I think most of the world could learn from some of these simple songs. It's like saying I'm sorry is the first step, then how can I help? Which is key, because often I like to say I'm sorry, and then we think we're done. No, it's, you say you're sorry, then what can I do to help you? What can I do to rectify the situation? You see some of these celebrity apologies, like when one guy slaps another guy on live TV, it's, I'm sorry it was bad. That's not enough. How do we rectify the situation? How do we help repair the hurt we've caused? So, Mr. Rogers, he's a wise guy, Presbyterian minister, so he should be. So I hope to do those things in the future.
Steve, the Corrymeela story reminds me in a similar but smaller way the work we as a church do with the Presbyterian Education Board. Those 25 schools are made up of Muslim and Christian students. In fact, the majority are Muslim. But they live together, they work together, they learn how to get along together, which I find just an amazing byproduct of what goes on over there and what we as a group help support.
It's almost as if someone like Jim Crow should share more of their story when they visited Pakistan and learn about that school and some of the things that go on there. Because we talk about it a lot, but I hope more of us will get to go over in the future and really see. So I think anyone who went kind of said they heard Debbie Hogue talk about it, but when they went, it's like a switch. You gain so much more when you actually get to sit at table with folks. And yeah, I mean, doing stuff with the Pakistan Education Board in Pakistan, creating those safe spaces, those safe schools of education where people of different religions can work together. And while it's a Christian school, often the Muslims want to go there because it's the better education they can get. So again, the power of education is so important. Education is often built around story. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to go get ready for a church service now. But you know what you can do? You have like 40 minutes before church, which you could do. What you could do, just throwing out there, is you could talk to somebody you haven't talked to before and get to know them. Maybe, just maybe, hear a bit of their story. And you might just find a new friend or a new insight. Just throwing it out there, but you could. You could.
Stephen, hearing what we heard just this morning from you, I'm going to exempt myself from church. I don't need to go.
But I have a whole different topic. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
I'm using your table.
Okay.
Mine,
From Al.
I've just given up.
Did you go there on
I
service?
spent
I did.
the better part of 2
I
weeks
usually
trying
go
the
there.
cable,
Do you?
the cable.
Yeah, it depends.
This-